Welcome to today's Explainer. Get your virtual notebooks ready because we are operating as a detailed classroom history lesson today, exploring the highly complex tenure of a man once known as the savior of the Punjab. You see, John Laird Mayor Lawrence stepped into the massive role of Viceroy and Governor-General of India in 1864. He brought with him this incredibly hands-on, deeply administrative background. But as he'd quickly find out, running the entirety of British India was a very, very different beast than his earlier days in the Punjab.
Okay, let's dive into our syllabus to understand the events that defined his 5 years in power. We'll start with Lord Lawrence Viceroy timeline, followed by the outbreak of the Dewar War, the Treaty of Sinchilla, the devastating 1866 Orissa famine, his fascinating policy of masterly inactivity, and finally, we'll weigh the legacy of Lawrence.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Lord Lawrence's Viceroy timeline. To really anchor our lesson, we need to map out exactly when these major historical events occurred. This chronological roadmap beautifully illustrates a term that was just packed with both infrastructural progress and immense crises. He's appointed in 1864 and literally immediately faces the outbreak of the Dewar War. Moving to 1865, he connects the telegraph to Europe and signs the Treaty of Sinchilla. Then, right in the middle of his tenure, the catastrophic Orissa famine strikes in 1866. 1868 brings an end to the Afghan succession crisis and introduces New Tenancy Acts, which leads us right up to the conclusion of his term in 1869.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Dewar War begins.
Let's zoom in on 1864, where border friction in the East escalated into a full-blown military conflict. The spark? Well, it was a totally failed diplomatic mission over a valuable buffer zone known as the Dwars. Back in 1863, the British envoy Ashley Eden was sent in to negotiate, but instead of a warm diplomatic welcome, he was met with evasion, constant delay, and ultimately threats. He was basically forced to sign what the British considered an obnoxious treaty handing over the territory. When word got back, Lord Lawrence immediately repudiated the forced agreement, effectively kicking off the Dewar War by November 1864.
Now, impartially speaking, the combatants were starkly mismatched. Look at these numbers. The British organized a field force of nearly 4,000 troops, and they were equipped with modern weaponry and heavy howitzers. Facing them were just 2,000 to 3,000 Bhutanese Jong guards, armed with traditional matchlocks, bows, swords, and catapults. On paper, it looks like a walkover, right?
Actually, it was far from an immediate British victory. What's really interesting here is how the vastly under-equipped Bhutanese initially mounted a surprisingly effective resistance. In February 1865, they swept down on the eastern post of Dawangiri. They ingeniously cut off the fort's water supply, forced a full British evacuation, and, in a humiliating blow to British military prestige, they actually captured 2 of those heavy howitzer guns.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Treaty of Sinchilla.
So the British definitely didn't take that loss lightly. After reinforcements arrived and recaptured the fort, Lawrence utilized a summer monsoon lull to force negotiations. This culminated in the Treaty of Sinchilla in November 1865. As you can see, the outcome was severe for Bhutan, resulting in a loss of 20% of its territory. British India secured the Assam and Bengal Dewars in perpetuity, along with 83 kilometers of Dawangiri. In exchange, just to stabilize the region, the British agreed to pay Bhutan an annual subsidy of 50,000 rupees.
Now, Lawrence's background in the Punjab was characterized by strict administration and ruthlessly cutting expenses. But the true test of governance often comes from the sky, not the battlefield. So, we have to ask, what happens when an administration built entirely for bureaucratic efficiency faces a massive, unpredictable, natural disaster?
We find out in Section 4, the 1866 Orissa famine.
As we move our timeline to 1866, the administration faced an absolute humanitarian catastrophe. The Orissa famine was a tragedy born from a perfect storm of environmental failure and rigid administrative adherence to economic theory. It was a chronological cascade of failures. First, a severe monsoon failure in 1865 decimates the rice crop. Then, colonial officials stubbornly stick to laissez-faire market policies, meaning grain exports continued flowing out of Bengal ports while locals literally starved. Third, administrative relief was heavily delayed by summer floods and arrived far too late. And finally, massive outbreaks of cholera and malaria swept through the already weakened population.
The devastating result was a massive loss of life. To put this staggering number into perspective, we're talking about 4 to 5 million people.
40 to 50 lakh lives lost. That completely wiped out a third of the population in the isolated Orissa region.
This horrific loss of life exposed severe, fatal flaws in the government's approach. In the aftermath, they were forced to pivot. The government established the Campbell Famine Commission, which formally recognized that the region's isolation and the administration's rigid economic ideology had actively worsened the natural disaster. This marked a major turning point, forcing colonial administrators to emphasize better transportation and proactive, timely relief delivery for future crises.
Shifting our focus from the domestic front, let's look at Section 5, the policy of masterly inactivity.
Following the absolutely disastrous First Anglo-Afghan War decades earlier, Lawrence adopted a new approach for the volatile northwest frontier. He called it masterly inactivity. It sounds a bit like a contradiction, doesn't it? But it was actually a highly pragmatic, cautious doctrine. It advocated strict non-interference in internal Afghan affairs, opting to secure British frontiers using natural mountain borders instead of launching costly military expeditions deep into the Hindu Kush.
This policy was built entirely on strategic restraint. The core rules were simple. The British would refuse to interfere in Afghan wars of succession. They would simply recognize whoever managed to establish de facto control over Kabul. They promised to station no British military garrisons in Afghan territory, treating it as a true sovereign buffer state. And instead of provoking conflict by advancing outward, they chose to just fortify their own side of the Indus River border.
And Lawrence actually held true to this. When a brutal 5-year civil war broke out after Amir Das Muhammad Khan's death in 1863, Lawrence remained completely neutral. He literally just watched and waited. When Sher Ali Khan finally won out and unified Afghanistan in 1868, Lawrence formally recognized him. He provided a subsidy of £60,000 and some modern rifles, successfully securing a friendly buffer state without spilling a single drop of British blood.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 6, the legacy of Lawrence.
As Lawrence's term wound down in early 1869, he left behind a very complex footprint. Beyond the wars and famines, his tenure was deeply marked by the direct mechanics of governance and some major infrastructural feats. In 1865, he opened the first direct submarine telegraph line between India and Europe, an absolute game-changer for global communication. He created a dedicated irrigation department, and in 1868 he passed the Punjab and Oath Tenancy Acts, which attempted to protect traditional peasant cultivators from arbitrary evictions.
So, to conclude our history lesson today, we have to look at the duality of his era. He brilliantly navigated the Afghan frontier and built up vital global infrastructure. Yet, the strict administrative rigidity of his government failed millions of people during the Orissa famine. Was the savior of the Punjab fundamentally better suited for direct crisis management? Or did his cautious policies actually lay the groundwork for modern administration? How do we weigh the advancement of bureaucratic efficiency against the staggering human cost of its failures? Well, that is a heavy, complex question, and definitely something for all of us to chew on as we wrap up today's explainer. Thanks for joining me.